Pondering God, Chapter 44, Peter, Uncommonly Courageous. I recently asked my class of high school boys to think about all the characters in the Bible, Old and New Testaments, and tell me to whom they most related. One said Rahab the harlot, but I think he only did that for effect. Another of the boys said Peter. I too thought that Peter was the one character in the Bible to whom I most related, for a variety of reasons. I admire King David and Joseph, but it's much harder to relate to them. After all, I'm not a king or second in command to Pharaoh. Peter, on the other hand, comes from a common background, a working man, a fisherman. I asked the boys for what one or two things Peter is most remembered, and they came up with two events. The first one is the occasion when Peter denied the Lord 3 times. The second is the time when he walked on water for a moment, and then sank like a rock due to a lack of faith. It is these failures that link me to Peter the most, but after a closer look, I feel our myopic view of history judges Peter too harshly. Let's look at Peter's failures a little closer. The account of Peter's denials is chronicled in Mark chapter 14, verses 66 through 72. In this narrative, numerous people confront Peter as having been one of Jesus' followers. In fear, Peter adamantly denies this, and eventually, after a third challenge, loses his temper and swears that he never knew Jesus. It's easy to look at this narrow account and conclude that Peter was a coward. When I asked the boys if they had ever denied Jesus, they all agreed that they had, to which I concurred. Maybe not verbally, but with my silence, I have denied the Lord. Upon further review, there are mitigating circumstances that must be considered before concluding that Peter was a coward. If you go back to the garden, earlier that night during Jesus' arrest, you notice something happened that sheds a different light on Peter. In Mark chapter 14 it says, "A multitude with swords and clubs had come with Judas to seize Jesus. When they laid hands on Jesus, one of his followers drew his sword to defend him. Only one, Peter. Drawing your sword against an armed multitude doesn't speak of cowardice. On the contrary, loyalty and bravery come to mind. I would also add impetuousness, another of Peter's traits to which I relate. In Mark chapter 14, verse 50, it says, "And they all left him and fled." Now back to the denials. Since they had all fled earlier that night, what was Peter doing hanging around the courtyard outside Jesus' trial? Why were none of the others there, except John, from his account in John chapter 18, verses 15 through 16? If Peter were such a coward, why would he risk being seen and possibly arrested? It takes a strong, loyal man to put himself in that position. Let's look at the other event for which Peter is best remembered. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 25 through 31, we read the account of Jesus walking on the sea and the reaction of the disciples in the boat. In 14:26 it says, "And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were frightened, saying, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out for fear." When Jesus instructed them to not be afraid, who was it that got out of the boat and walked to Jesus? I don't recall any of the other disciples being brave or faithful enough to even try. Peter may be remembered for sinking, but because of his faith he was put in that position, whereas none of the others were. Peter made many mistakes, but it wasn't for lack of trying. In other examples, we see Peter leading the way, sticking his neck out, trying to please the Lord. Which disciple, when asked by Jesus who they thought he truly was, answered in Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God"? Which of the disciples, after Jesus' resurrection, while in a boat moored 100 yards from shore, recognized Jesus on the land and, fully clothed, jumped into the water and swam to shore? Which of the disciples stood before the hostile religious leaders of the day and, under threat of imprisonment, beating, and death, said this in Acts chapter 4, verse 19, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge, for we cannot stop speaking what we have seen and heard." The lesson here, and why I relate so much to Peter, isn't that he wasn't a coward. No, the lesson here is that as followers of Jesus, we will all make mistakes and fall far short of the mark. But as Peter showed us, it is better to be aggressive in our faith and make mistakes than to be timid and hide our faith under a bushel. His story also teaches us that just because we mess up, we don't quit. Peter got it right far more often than he got it wrong. He surely denied Jesus in that courtyard, but he was in that courtyard when only he and John had the faith or guts to be there. Although I am like Peter in his failures, I strive to be loyal and please the Lord as he did, and I aspire to be as courageous in my faith as he was.